recorded by a lot of people. Everybody from Johnny Cash on forth. Hope that you all did enjoy that. I would like to, as I said, talk to you about, I wanted to do something different. I know you had a lot of programs about a lot of different aspects of the railroad. I wanted to kind of do the relation between the Civil War and what happened here in Saluda during the Civil War, which is in historical realms, the Civil War is probably the genre that sells the most books. I don't know if you know that or not, but it's really interesting to a lot of people. A lot of interesting things happen here in the Civil War. I'm James Metcalf. I'm the chief guide at the Polk County History Museum. My ancestors came here to Polk County before the Revolutionary War. Lieutenant Anthony Metcalf and his sons left here and went off to war in Georgia and came back and fought the Tories and the Cherokee here during the Revolution. And after the war, when this part of western North Carolina was taken away again from the Indians, my family received a Revolutionary War grant up on the mountaintop where I live. I still own 8 acres of that land grant. A lot of my family members, distant relatives, still do as well. So Saluda is very important to me. My great-grandfather, we'll talk about him and show you a picture. My great-grandfather was a prison guard in the late 1870s when they built the railroad, and he was a man that witnessed the first train that came down on the grade. And he told one of his grandchildren one day that they weren't sure whether they could get the train stopped when the first one came down the mountain. So that's quite a statement, for the history of Saluda. But I would like to talk to you about briefly about how we got started here in what we now call Saluda. It was called different names and different things before the railroad came. This is the 1808 map of western North Carolina, and this, as you can see, the state line goes straight across. And today, of course, the part of Saluda where I live is it dips down a little bit, and the line was changed. Where I live up here was part of South Carolina in that time. This was Rutherford County, and this was Buncombe County. Henderson County was Buncombe County before, in the beginning. This is one of the earliest maps of that time period after the Revolutionary War, of course. And many of this land, like I said, was taken away from the Indians again, and they were pushed farther back into the mountains. And a lot of this land in what is now present-day Henderson County was given to Revolutionary War soldiers for their service in the war. And that's why you see a lot of Revolutionary War soldiers buried in Henderson County, because they received land grants and moved into the area, including Saluda, which several received land grants here. And, interesting about the state line, in the early 1900s, the Henderson County newspaper ran a story, and they said a man named Ransom Pace was born in Rutherford County, lived in Buncombe County and Henderson County, and now lives in Polk County as an old man, but he lived in the same house. So it's kind of tricky when you do genealogy, because you have to go to all these counties to find that. But anyway, this area became a gateway to the mountains. I think I've got here, they started, the drovers' trails to take, the produce from the mountains down to Charleston and vice versa. There were different roads that were built in our area across the mountains, including, I think when you look at the 1808 map, you see a line which really represents Hobbart's Cove Road. That was probably one of the earliest roads that came through. Later on, Howard Gap Road was built through our mountains, and parts of Howard Gap is still travel. You can still travel today. Not all of it, but it's basically on the same line of that old mountain road called Howard Gap Road. And also there was the Saluda Gap Road that came up from Greenville, and there was Payson's Gap as well, Mills Gap in the higher part of the county. But this right here is an 1847 map of Polk County. It shows the Howard Gap Road. And this is today what we call the area of Saluda. This is my great-great-great-grandfather's little dot, William Metcalf. I live right next to that today. Jesse Rhodes lived right across from Pearson Falls. And I'll show you a picture of that house later on, right here on the Packlet River. Churchill Morris, and you hear the story about the Century Oak Fire, and the Morris family lived up here, at Howard Gap and Hobbart's Cove area. So these were some of the early pioneers, as well as Statons and Paces, of course, and Hips were some of the early pioneers of what we now call Saluda. Now the tricky thing is, and a lot of people make mistakes about this, that Saluda, what we now call the Saluda Township, was not called the Saluda Township until the railroad came through. if you look at the first censuses of Polk County in 1860, and you see the names, you realize that they lived in what was called the Tryon Township. What is now Tryon City was part of the Columbus Township. But the first Tryon post office, the first post office called Tryon was this one right here, the home of Asbury Thompson. And this house stood until the 1940s, you know, where the old Mountain View Hotel, I don't know what it's called now, the Saluda Mountain Lodge, the hotel, it was in that area where this house stood. The Thompson family, who owned it, tore it down in the 1940s. Homer Thompson built a brick house there. If you remember Cub and Monk Thompson, that was their daddy's house. If any of you knew Cub or Monk Thompson, it was, that house stood. This stagecoach stop, it was a post office. It was first called the Tryon Post Office. It was a store, it was a school, it was a big center of activity here in the Saluda area in the early pioneer days. And Asbury Thompson, after the Civil War, he fought in the Civil War, went on to be in our state legislature and represent Polk County in the state legislature as well. But Asbury Thompson, a really interesting man. It's a shame that this house was torn down because, you know, that'd be a historic site. I don't know, Glenn, maybe Glenn remembers that house, that Thompson house over there. Maybe some of you old folks, you don't remember it, but it was torn down in the 40s. But that was the center of activity because it was at the intersection of Harvard's Cove and Howard Gap Road in what is now Saluda. But as I said, it was called the Tryon Township. Now, Tryon, the Wikipedia that has the history of Tryon in it, they say that this was in Lynn, but it was not because that was not Tryon at that day, and they didn't realize, whoever wrote that didn't realize that. But it's a fact that very few people know this was called the Tryon Township. And to make it even more confusing, across the Greenville County line in North Greenville County, there was a Saluda Township below where Mountain Page is today. So that kind of also makes it confusing. And of course, there's always the story that it was called Pace's Gap. You don't really see a lot of documentation of it being officially called Pace's Gap, but apparently, passed down stories, it was apparently a nickname for this area, Pace's Gap, you know, because Pace's Gap came in. And I don't know why they took the Pace's Gap name away and called it Saluda. Maybe somebody didn't like Pace's, whoever voted on it. But anyway, as Saluda grew, of course, you know, there were these trails, these drovers trails that took place, especially coming up, you going down through Greenville from the mountains, and there was a toll booth at the top of the Saluda grade where I-26 is today. That was part of Howard Gap Road. And for many years, Columbus Mills and other entrepreneurs operated a toll booth there, and they charged for every pig and every animal that came through. And then the Geis family also had one, as you know, where the I-26 high bridge is today. That's named after the Geis family. There was a bridge down below there. I used to have a picture of that. I've got one somewhere before it rotted away. But the Howard Gap Road was a well-traveled road, and it was an easy road to get to Asheville and so forth. So there was, I don't know how much they had to pay, but they had to pay to go these roads, and they made some money on it. So this activity was taking place here. The early pioneer families were building their homes and starting their farms, and a few businesses took place. It wasn't a village like we have today or we had earlier, but you know, in the communities they had grist mills. There was at least two in the Mountain Page and Fort Creek area, and in other places down in the Packlet Valley there was a grist mill that people would come and trade their corn, their dried corn, for cornmeal and other goods. So these little things were done. Now, my great-great-grandfather, Burl Pace, lived up in the Fort Creek community, had 1,300 acres up there, and there is a document, we're talking about businesses now, there is a document in the 1860 area where he went to the North Carolina Supreme Court and wanted to have his neighbor arrested, which was a female named Elizabeth Pitts, have her arrested because she had a house of ill repute. And we know what that is, you know. And it's kind of interesting you think about that being in our little community there, but my great-great-grandfather wanted to put a stop to that, and he talked about men and women sitting around in the bed, and her teenage daughter was there around all this and all that kind of stuff. So some of that went on as well. Let's talk about the railroad. Let's talk about the railroad. Who wants to tell me who the first real official railroad was in the United States?
Charleston.
You got it right, Charleston. It went from Charleston into the inward Bamberg area of South Carolina, you know, big cotton, tobacco area, and other goods. They wanted a way that they could get goods to the coast quicker, and also passengers. The French had started using railroads in their mining operations, and it caught on in America in the 1830s. You have a picture up here. What's the name of that train way up on the top there?
Best Friend.
Best Friend of Charleston. How many have ever ridden on the Best Friend of Charleston? I have.
Wow.
How many were here for the Centennial, 1981 in Saluda? Nobody. Nobody. You're a bunch of newcomers, I guess. Were you there? But Southern Railway, in 1981, we had our Saluda Centennial. I was 12 years old. And they brought a replica of the Best Friend of Charleston, looked just like that up on that top picture, which here is also a picture on the screen here. But they brought the replica, and I got to ride from Hace's store down to this depot, which used to be down there next to my cousin Virgil's house. And they offered free rides on the Best Friend of Charleston. So I was always a big history buff. I was 12 years old then, and I read a lot about that. And I don't know if any of you folks know Walter and Wally Pace. Wally Pace was a few years younger. He's probably about 10. And you had to take the ride, but you had to walk back. And Wally told his daddy, he said, "Daddy, I think I can walk on the rail all the way back." And he said, "Well, if you do, I'll give you $5. And poor old little Wally tried for a while, and he fell off. That's the first time I was in this depot. Was during the 1981 Centennial. They had some special displays in there. I'm surprised nobody was there, but me.
And that would have been within just a few years of it moving from there to here.
Yeah.
2 to 3 years.
Yeah, so anyways, the railroads, and my dad's first cousin, Virgil Pace, lived down there. He's dead now, but I remember Dad would take our vehicle down there to get fixed. Virgil was a great mechanic, and he'd charge about $5. That's what he'd always say, about $5 to fix something. And he later bought the Exxon down here on Main Street. But I remember being down there at his house, and he said the depot was sitting there idle, and he said that sometimes he'd pull up cars underneath when it was raining, underneath the eaves, and work on cars there. The deed said that was his grandpa Sam Summey's place over here. His son Roger lives there, and that's where all the cars are. He works on cars. But his grandpa Sam Summey owned the property, and in the deed it said that the depot was supposed to go to the landowner if it stopped being a railroad depot, which it did. And I remember after they moved it, Virgil would say, "Well, I could have said something, but I didn't. I just let him take it." Of course, the Ergel family made a lot of money off of this depot after they got it for hardly anything and moved it up here. But that's the story with my cousin Virgil in this depot, that reflection I had. Let's get back. The railroad started in the 1830s. And they first started this Best Friend of Charleston route, and it was a very primitive railroad, as you can see. And they started hauling, you really couldn't haul a lot of cotton and stuff, but I guess it was easier than taking it in wagons and stuff. But they started this railroad, and of course, by the 1840s, railroads were continuing on, and they started talking about, we need a railroad that comes from Charleston up through the mountains into Ohio and the Ohio River, so goods can be shipped back and forth from the west. And the Ohio River, of course, was a big shipping river at that time. So in the 1840s and 1850s, they started developing a company to build the Charleston, Ohio Railroad. It was changed. The name was changed many times. That's what I'm going to call it tonight. It's the Charleston, Ohio Railroad. It went by a lot of different names, like the Cincinnati, Chicago, Charleston Railroad, and because it changed hands and went bankrupt over and over and over and over again. But that was their plans, to have a railroad from Charleston to Ohio. And so they started developing it, discussing it, surveying it, talking about it, raising money for it was the big thing, and then going bankrupt, and then starting another plan for it. And this went on a lot into the 1840s. And by 1860, as you can see here, see if I can get this a little bigger, this was the rail lines in the United States in the 1860s. And, they really started growing by that time. By the time of the Civil War, there was a lot of rail transportation. You can see these western railroads in the western cities. There was, plenty of trains too, and up in the Northeast as well. And they kept on building these railroads, and railroad owners were getting rich on them. But going through the mountains just did not take place. Now, just before the Civil War, a company had, I should have this all in front of me, but I don't. A company had started up the plans again. And they got as far before the Civil War as Greenville, Tennessee, and down to Greenville, South Carolina. And so, you could take a train to Greenville, but if you wanted to come here to Western North Carolina, you had to come here to either Shelby, North Carolina, or Greenville, Tennessee, in order to get to through these mountains here. So they, just right before the Civil War, and this is what we're going to talk about, they had come up again with the plans and surveys, and they were going to bring it through Polk County. And the surveying came all the way as far as Flat Rock. Do anybody know where Butte Mountain is? where GE, in the area where GE plant is today. They had surveyed all the way there before the Civil War started. Now, the original plans for the railroad, and you all have Matt Baumgartner's book. How many of you have a copy of that? Proselyte, he just passed away sadly a few months ago, and he was that's a wonderful book. If you really want to go more in depth in what I'm talking about tonight, buy that book if you can. He had just printed a bunch of copies. He was supposed to bring me some for the museum, our museum to sell, but he died before he got them to me, so I'm going to try to see if I get some. But in his book, he's got the original maps of how the original plans for the railroad to come through Polk County. It was not supposed to come down here. It was supposed to go down where Howard's Cove is, and one route took it down where Howard's Gap is, where Howard's Cove is. In 1847, when they made the first county seat in what is now called Mill Spring, the plans were for the railroad to come through there and around and down into South Carolina. It wasn't going to come to this part of the county, which was a very undeveloped part of Polk County at the time. And they advertised in newspapers across North Carolina that you can buy lots where the railroad is coming in the new Polk County seat. Well, they dissolved Polk County in 1848, and then in 1855, they formed it again for the second time. And this time, they decided instead of having the county seat in Mill Spring, that they were going to put it in the middle of the county in a place called Foster's Race Path. 3 landowners donated enough land to put 100 lots in this area of a field, and they divided up the lots to sell to make money for building the courthouse and the jail and the school in Columbus. But they again advertised that the railroad was now going to come through Columbus. So they sold premium lots, letting the people know that this railroad from Charleston to Ohio was coming. And that was in 1855. 1861 came, and what happened in 1861? The Civil War. There is a man that died in 1942. His name was Martin Cornwall. He was the last Confederate soldier in Polk County to die in 1942, just as World War II had started. He was from the Green Creek area, and he grew up in downtown Columbus. His dad had a blacksmith shop in the early days of the county seat. And he wrote, in 1926, he wrote a letter to his daughter who asked about the formation of Polk County and also the Civil War. And it's a great first-hand account document if you ever get a chance to read it. But he talked about how Columbus was developing. They were expecting the railroad. He was a teenager at that time. And how the school systems were being built. And we were looking forward to Polk County being a great, industrious county and a crossroads for transportation. But then the Civil War happened. And it put a stop to everything. It ruined everything. And that's what I want to talk to you a little bit about today. The Civil War started and put an end to a lot of economic development in North Carolina. Many of you folks don't know this, but when the new Confederacy took place, they actually ended up taking all the school money in Raleigh and putting it to the war effort and taking away all the money. And most all of the schools in North Carolina shut down because of that, and plus most of the school teachers, including 5 from Polk County, were in the Confederate uniform fighting Confederacy. So it closed down a lot of schools and really hurt the economy. There's not a time in America that has ever been as bad as the Civil War. Not the Great Depression, not World War I or World War II, but the Civil War. You had both the war and the economic downturn and the brother against brother thing. There was a lot of renegades and a lot of sad things that went on in the Civil War. Now here's a picture of the Polk County Courthouse. This is probably the oldest picture we have of the Polk County Courthouse. I put this in here when I talk about the courthouse. This is really 1909, and all these guys are sitting around waiting for court to start or what have you, But the courthouse was built by about 1859, and so Polk County had been formed, as I mentioned, and then the war started, and men from all across, all corners of Polk County went off to war. And in my grandparents' families, my great-grandpa lost 2 Metcalfs in the Civil War. There were 6 Metcalfs that went to war, only 2 of them returned. And in my grandma's Pace side, there's a lot of different Pace sides. My grandma's side, she lost 3 of her uncles. Well, she wasn't born yet, but she lost 3 of her uncles, and one of them who actually deserted and hid out in the caves up in Fort Creek during the Civil War. But it took a big toll on families and the economy and everything else. And one thing here in the mountains, there was a lot of caves. There's still caves out there where people hid out, deserters and Union soldiers. And then there was the scourge of the renegades. there were bands of renegades. Some of them were deserters, some of them were those that did not go to war, but they went around stealing and taking livestock and stealing valuables. There was a cave up above Carl Sandburg's home where a group of these renegades hid out. There was a Union soldier who escaped from Georgia, Andersonville prison camp, and he talked in his diary about someone sending them there. So these guys would take you to Union lines for a bit of money. But they said there was a cave up above there, and it was called, of course, Glassy Rock, or is what he mentioned. And these renegades were inside this cave, and they had a big oil painting of George Washington that they had stole from one of these flat rock mansions that was covered in mold. They had fancy candelabras and chandeliers that they had hung in this cave, and carpet on the floor that they had stolen, and they were just kind of building a little mansion but staying there, and they were going down. They even murdered several prominent people in Flat Rock. But it happened also here in what we call the Saluda area. There was my grandmother. My grandmother died when I was 8 years old, but before she died, I remember her talking about her father being a young boy, not old enough to be in the war, but he and my other great-grandfather, the Metcalf, hid their livestock out in the woods because these renegades would come from farm to farm and take what chickens and pigs they said. So a lot of these people would get their children and their slaves, if they had slaves, to hide out in the woods with their valuables. And it's interesting, in the research I did for my Civil War book, I did a whole chapter on African Americans, and it's interesting how many families entrusted their slaves with their valuables. And only the slaves knew where the gold and the things that were hidden out there. And several times these renegades tortured the slaves to try to find out. But that's how much, a lot of masters trusted their slaves, is to hide their gold for them. And that's interesting. But a lot of this went on, and a lot of stealing and things like that. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some events that took place here in the Saluda area in the Civil War. And one of these guys I like to tell about is Captain B.T. Morris. The Morrises lived, as I said, around the Hawkins Cove area and what used to be the Howard Gap Road. There was a lot of Morrises. They must have been pretty educated because a lot of them were captains and lieutenants in the 64th North Carolina, which really included a lot of Saluda people. Two of my great-great uncles on Pace side were also in the 64th. And Captain B.T. Morris wrote a diary in 1906 about his war experiences. Really, I'd rather read a diary of a Civil War soldier than a textbook done by some college professor any day, because it's in their memoirs. B.T. Morris became captain of a company of the 64th. And the 64th fought in the Tennessee Theater in the early part of the war. But their general surrendered all of them at Cumberland Gap. And just about the whole regiment was surrendered, most of them sent to Illinois to a prison camp to be for the rest of the war. Captain B.T. Morris and a handful of others, maybe about 100 out of 1,000, did not surrender and were able to escape. But they were sent back here to Polk County, Henderson County, Polk County, Western North Carolina, to serve as Confederate Home Guard. And he talked about in his memoirs that it was much easier to fight the Yankee who did not know the terrain than fight the home folks that knew where to hide out and as they tried to round up deserters and things like that. Captain B.T. Morris in his memoirs talked about rounding some of these people up. And one of his soldiers went home on leave into the Green River Cove. And his name was Henry Perkins. Just before the war ended, Henry Perkins was sent home to take leave. And while he was there, a renegade up on the hill above him shot and killed him on his front steps. Henry Perkins was able to tell who this renegade man was. B.T. Morris doesn't say it in his memoirs who the name was, but he was apparently a scoundrel. He called him a scoundrel in his memoirs that they went after the next day after this Henry Perkins was killed. And in his notes, this is what he says in the Green River Cove. He said, "We searched in the woods and the hills for this man, and finally someone told us that he frequented a place where some bad women lived." So, you know what kind of place that was. And they came looking for him at that place, and apparently he had gone, but the women were trying to make noise and let him know somewhere up in the woods he was. One of B.T. Morris's soldiers found him, and this scoundrel tried to shoot one of the soldiers. The soldier shot him back and killed him 2 days after he had shot Henry Perkins. So that took place in there. B.T. Morris took place in the Battle of Asheville. In the last days of the war, Stoneman's army had come to western North Carolina. One of their objectives were to capture Asheville. The other objective was to go to Salisbury, where the Confederate prison was, and release Union soldiers. And also, after Jefferson Davis was fleeing, they were in process of trying to capture Jefferson Davis. Stoneman's army failed on all of these things. They came to Asheville from Tennessee, and B.T. Morris talks in his memoirs that the soldiers that were there under Colonel Love of Western North Carolina, they were in the trenches. If you know where UNC Asheville is today, you can still see these trenches on that property as you go up I-26 around where Urban is. And they decided that they would try to make the Yankees think, Stoneman's army think, that there were more rebels than there was, and they just had the soldiers just kind of walk around and march around the trenches over and over and over again to make them think there was a whole army there. They did shoot and engage in battle at this battle at Asheville, and there was only one man that was wounded, and he was a man from right here in Saluda named Frank Hobart from Hobart's Cove family. He was the only one wounded in that battle of Asheville. So Stoneman's army went. Now you can talk a whole program on Stoneman's raid. It was one of the biggest raids in the Civil War, the longest miles and everything. But Stoneman's army decided that they would come around through Virginia and try to take Asheville through the Shenandoah Gap. And you all know how steep the Shenandoah Gap is on I-40, you know, and they were attempting to go through there. But it was there that the rebels decided that if they cut down every tree that they could and crossed the pass, no cavalry force could make it through. So Stoneman's army failed to get to Asheville that way the second time. And so they decided to go southward and go through Hickory Nut Gorge. And Captain B.T. Morris here at this time, all the other lieutenants and captains were gone, so he became captain of the entire regiment of the 64th. And he was at Hickory Nut Gorge where they had cannons, and they were able to dispel the Stoneman's army a third time trying to get across the mountains. Now, this is not much about the railroad, but I just want to talk a little about several more here in our area. So, Captain Morris said he was at Hickory Nut, and he was only 8 miles from home, and he decided to borrow a horse from a friend and come home and be with his wife one night before he returned to battle. Well, while they were there at Hickory Nut, the other generals and colonels found out that Lee had surrendered. The soldiers from Appomattox surrendered. This was April 22nd, 21st, and 20th. Had been coming home from Appomattox, the ones that left early, and started telling both the Yankee and the Confederate soldiers that Lee had surrendered and Johnson was just about to surrender the rest of the North Carolina troops. And so they were no longer wanting to fight, both the Union and the Confederates. The Union, of course, they were very upset because they had also heard that Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated. And the Stoneman's army had not received paychecks in months, and they were ready to steal anything they could from the Southerners. And that's what they did, especially in Rutherford County and Henderson County. But so there was one more attempt to cross the mountains and to come to Asheville, and it was right here in Polk County at Howard's Gap. I'm a very amateur painter, but there's not any historical photos, paintings of Polk County, and I painted this depiction of Howard's Gap. Now, the reason that Stoneman's army was successful in coming through Howard Gap was why? Because the Confederates no longer wanted to fight because the war was over, right? And Colonel Palmer at Hickory Nut decided to send the cannons away and not move them to Howard Gap. And he also told a lot of the soldiers, he said, well, the war is over. So there was only a handful, according to the story, there's only a handful that were at Howard's Gap during this battle in which Stoneman's army finally came through. Now, there's very little documentation about this. And I don't know how many of y'all see the marker down there in Lynn that talks Howard's Gap historical marker, and it talks about the skirmish that took place on April 22nd. And it was one of the last skirmishes between the armies in our area in North Carolina. There was a battle in Georgia and Oklahoma afterwards, but this was probably the last real skirmish between both armies in North Carolina in the Civil War, right here at Howard's Gap. But there was let's see, I've got a picture of him. This guy right here from Pennsylvania, his name was Frank Frankenberry. What a name. He was a signal corpsman in the Union Army in Stoneman's raid, and he was the one that went ahead of time. So he talks about coming through Polk County, seeing the Polk County Courthouse in Columbus, and then seeing a majestic waterfall on the mountain above. And you know, in Columbus, you see that, you know, and he mentioned that in his diary. And he was from Michigan, but he was with apparently the Pennsylvania guy. But, you know, all your life you hear about this Battle of Howard's Gap. And as a child, I was always interested in history. And I always imagined a big battle taking place there. But apparently there was only a handful of Confederates that tried to hold off this entire army as they came through. Frankenberry in his diary said he mentioned 2 words, slight resistance at this battle. So it is apparently not, but I wish there was documentation about who fought and how many fought. Was anybody wounded? Was anybody killed? But there wasn't. And they only mentioned slight resistance. Frankenberry also said that after crossing Howard Gap, he had an argument with a local fellow that had a heated argument. And I wish he could tell who that person was that they had a heated argument with, but they did. But back to B.T. Morris. B.T. Morris, as we heard previously, that he was home with his wife that night. And in his memoirs, he said, we got up to take breakfast at my dad's house, which was Churchill Morris. We showed him on the map earlier. And they had got up, walking down Howard Gap Road, and said that he found that the road was filled up with Union soldiers. And he was in his Confederate uniform. And he said he tried to act inconspicuous, just keep walking, hoping they wouldn't notice, but they did, and they arrested him. Took him to Hendersonville. And in Hendersonville, they said that they would not give him a furlough, and especially because he was a captain, and laid him between 2 soldiers at night. And of course, at this time, both armies were not wanting to fight anymore. He said he got up in the middle of the night, snuck up in the mountains, and went home. That was the end of the war for Captain B.T. Morris. Stoneman's army also went to what we now call Carl Sandburg's home, and that was one of the subjects of our story tonight. We're going to talk a lot about is C.G. Meminger. He's the one that built the Carl Sandburg home in 1838. We don't call it the Meminger home. He lived in it for decades, him and his family, at least as a summer home. But Meminger was one of the founding fathers of the Confederate government. He was the first treasurer on the cabinet. And that's a pretty big deal in those days to have him living here in Flat Rock. He's buried at the Church of the Wilderness there, if you've ever been to that church cemetery. But he was one of the wealthiest men in America. He was very involved in a lot of economic ventures in Charleston area. He was an immigrant from Germany. He was an orphan, adopted by a man who taught him all about finance and bookkeeping and business and all this kind of stuff. So he was a perfect candidate for the Confederate government to choose as their treasurer. And as I'm going to talk about after the war, he became one of the presidents of the railroad that was built here in Saluda. We'll talk about that later. But here's a picture also of him in the cabinet, the Confederate cabinet that took place. And Stoneman's army went down. Frankenberry talked about going to his house, and he was not home. Frankenberry went there. He was not home, but he did pick up a rose out of his garden, which, like I said, is now the Carl Sandburg home, as a souvenir. And then Frankenberry and some of the other Stoneman's raiders went down into South Carolina to try to capture Jefferson Davis, who was headed down to Georgia and hopefully to the Gulf of Mexico, and they did not get them. So Stoneman's raid had a lot of failures, but one success they did was to get to Howard Gap. Okay, and this again is Meminger's grave, and I talked to you about Stoneman's raid, the Battle of Howard Gap in the Civil War. One other story here in our Saluda area. Many of you folks probably don't know this, but you know where the Orchard Lake Campground is? Everybody know where that is? And this is the area where my family's lived for 200 years up in that part of the mountain. That land on the Henderson County line of that community was primarily owned by the Staten family from the early 1800s on. And 2 of the Staten brothers had deserted from the army that was stationed at Flat Rock and decided that they would go home. One brother had a sick son, and the other brother wanted to go home and help his widowed mother put in the crops. This was May 1863. And this started happening, and soldiers decided that they had enough of war and they needed to go back and help with the family farms, and deserters at this time period in the Civil War were leaving the Confederacy. These 2 Staten boys had been at their mom's home when their lieutenant from the 35th North Carolina, which was called the Henderson County Rifles, the lieutenant came to arrest them with some other soldiers. They knocked on the door. According to the family story, they knocked on the door, and these soldiers, these Confederate soldiers, were inside their mama's home. And Mama said, they're putting their shoes on, they'll be right out. And they ran out the back door trying to escape. Well, Lieutenant Gary took his pistol and shot Ambrose Perry Staten, wounded him,
didn't kill him, wounded him. And then his brother, Reuben Staten, turned around with his gun and shot and killed Lieutenant Garrett there at their house. Lieutenant Garrett died a couple days later. The two brothers hid out on Mine Mountain, according to the family story, and some say it was a cave, some say it was a shock of hay, a big stack of hay that they hid in. But Ambrose Staten died a couple days later. Reuben later went off to Union lines, and he stayed up north for the rest of the war. Henderson County Court tried to try him after the war, but Andrew Johnson put out a, I can't think of the word right now, anyway, amnesty, an amnesty statement in May 1865 saying that the crimes of the Civil War could not be tried because the war was over. And that was what Johnson was trying to do to heal the South. So Reuben Staten never did stand trial for the murder of Lieutenant Garrett. So that happened, right here in the area. And I told you, I think about everything. I want to talk about the Saluda and the Civil War. But now let's get back to the railroad. Of course, the Civil War had ended, and our nation was economically strapped. Money was gone. There was no money for construction. The history books call that time period Reconstruction. True Southerners did not call it Reconstruction. They call it occupation. And the Yankees raised a lot of tax money. Where we get our moonshining activity took place because after the war, the new Yankee government started taxing liquor to try to make up for the war lost. And that's when the illegal liquor making started taking place in the late 1800s. It became a terrible thing. There was a lot of shooting and death and terrible things that went along with moonshining. My family did a lot of moonshining, and I do not apologizing for saying it was a bad thing. Just like the drug dealers in the inner cities today, they might make a little money now, but it causes destruction, as moonshining always did. But this happened because of the Yankees. Also, they raised taxes on property taxes, and a lot of people, especially not having the slave power anymore, were forced to sell off a lot of their land. And a lot of Yankees bought this land here in Polk County. A lot of that was bought by richer Yankees that came and bought a lot of this land up. So the economy here in our western North Carolina mountains were at a standstill. But by the 1870s, they started talking about the railroad again. And there were several investors that went to form money to build the railroad here through Polk County. And as I said, they weren't planning on building on this side of Polk County, but the other side. Now, one of our guys that has a lot of ties to Polk County was one of the richest men in America. His name was Franklin Cox. Here's his picture. Franklin Cox's wife was a Mills, and he bought the Green River Plantation on the other end of the county for her. But before he bought that, his family at one time owned about half of New Jersey in the colonial days. Seriously, half of them. They owned a lot of land. And they had a lot of coal mines and businesses, coal mines especially in Pennsylvania. They were one of the wealthiest families in America. They bought a good chunk of western North Carolina after the Revolutionary War and speculated that land. And a lot of the land, especially in Rutherford County, was owned by the Cox family at one time before they sold it in speculation and made millions and millions of dollars. These were like Rockefellers in those days. Franklin Cox was one of the richest men in North Carolina. He started investing in both Charlotte and Asheville real estate. He built a Battery Park Hotel. Anybody know about that? The Battery Park Hotel. And Cox Avenue in Asheville is named after him, actually, even though he really was a resident of Rutherford and Polk County. But he was such a big investor. But he also put a lot of money investing in the railroad. Now, the interesting story about him in the Civil War, you see him in his uniform here. He briefly joined the 3rd South Carolina. A lot of his rich relatives did as well, one of the first regiments that were formed. Well, when a guy that owns all this wealth in Pennsylvania joins the Confederacy, what's the United States government going to say? We're taking away all your coal mines. So he told the Confederate government that he was going to purchase a substitute for himself to fill that place in the Confederacy. He got guilty, and he decided that he would also pay for a substitute in the Union Army. And he went off to England, where he was safe, to conduct his business, which, England was a big trader for the Confederacy during the Civil War, and economically we probably would have been able to make it if it wasn't for England buying the southern cotton and selling goods back to the South. But anyway, he went to England and stayed there for the rest of the war. Sadly, both his substitutes, Union and Confederate, died in the Civil War. And in his later years, he had nightmares that they killed each other in the war. But anyways, Frank Cox, he actually donated a lot of money in early Polk County when the automobiles started rolling. He donated a lot of money for road repair and road building as well. And he died in the early 1900s. He was one of the early investors of the railroad, and we owe a lot to him here in Polk County. Now, Memminger, of course, after the Civil War, as they once again were attempting to build the railroad through western North Carolina from Greenville, Tennessee into Spartanburg, Memminger was put in charge and president of the railroad. And I should say he spent the remainder of the war not in Charleston but in Flat Rock, and that's where he died and was buried there as well. Memminger was, a very wealthy man in the area. Well, at that time he was probably a pretty big celebrity. But he was appointed the president of the Spartanburg-Asheville Railroad, and he decided that he would call on some Confederates he knew that were engineers and built railroads before the war. And the guy that he decided was going to put in charge of the engineering director was this guy, Colonel Thaddeus Coleman, who was from Asheville. And at the time when he was called to work on this railroad, he was building a railroad in Morristown, Tennessee. Before that, he had built a railroad in the Morganton area just before the war had started, and he went off to war. So Colonel Coleman was put in charge of that. Now, Colonel Coleman had been working with a guy that we all know of that in the railroad building, that who was also a captain, and that was Captain Charles Pearson. And that's how Charles Pearson ended up down here, is because Coleman had been working with him and knew he was a great engineer. I'm not talking about a railroad train driving engineer. I'm talking about a civil engineer that did the surveying and the planning and the mapping. And so that's how Captain Charles Pearson ended up in our area. Coleman decided that he wanted Captain Charles Pearson to find the way through the mountains. He thought that that would be a good thing. So they started on the original route through surveying anyway, the original route through the mountains into Columbus, which would go down to where the Landrum exit is now. At that time, that was called Earlsville, named after Colonel Earl, before Landrum was even thought of, Earlsville. And so this is what happened. One of the men who is most responsible for the towns of Saluda, Tryon, and Landrum is a guy named Ambrose Hampton from Cooper's Gap. Anybody ever heard of it? Probably not. You have. Okay. There's an interesting story. You see this in very, very few places. But the railroad company needed money from all of the counties that they were coming through. And they wanted Polk County to donate $10,000 from their taxpayers to build the railroad through Polk County. And they based the amount from each county on the amount of railroad that was being built in the county. Well, Ambrose Hampton did not like the railroad and did not like the idea of the railroad. So he got on his white horse and went all the way through Polk County. Polk County was going to vote in the next election on a bond issue of that $10,000 for taxpayer money to go to the railroad. He went around and he talked about all the evil that the railroad would bring, all the noise, how it would just upset their livestock, and all the wild ladies and the drinking and the carousing and all that would come around with the railroad. And he went throughout the county and said, do not vote for this bond issue. We don't want the railroad through Polk County. So when election time came, guess what? They voted against, Polk County voted against spending their tax dollars on the railroad. So the railroad decided, instead of going through the middle of Polk County, hitting the county seat, we are just going to take the least populated and the shortest route that we can go through Polk County, and that was here. And that's how the railroad got put on this end of the county. And so if it weren't for that railroad, the towns of Saluda, Tryon, and Landrum would have not been built. So they decided instead to go through this, and yes, it was a steep grade. Colonel Pearson decided, let me see, I got a picture of it. I meant to put a picture here of the trestle. Here it is, yeah. There was a story, Charles Pearson surveyed from Spartanburg all the way up to here to Henderson County and tried to come out with the best route. And he said the only way that we can make this route work now is if we build a trestle this high in Tryon. Anybody know where this is? If you know where the Tryon Antique Mall is in Tryon, you look behind it and there's a big mound with the railroad tracks on top of it. This trestle used to be here. And that was the biggest trestle on the line between Spartanburg and Asheville. And This was a picture from 1930. It was destroyed in a flood, and now it was covered up with dirt there. And so that was the key to making the railroad. I'm not an engineer, and I don't know anything about grading, but to making the railroad work was to build this big trestle in Tryon over Bonds Creek. And that's that. He said in his story that this was to come. So they built the railroad, and if you know where Cleveland Park is in Spartanburg, anybody heard of that? After Memminger, Cleveland became the president of the railroad. He was a very wealthy man in Spartanburg, and a lot of schools and parks are named after him. One of his daughters, I believe it was, later moved to Tryon and lived in the Scrivens plantation. She married Scrivens. But anyway, Colvin talked about, in a newspaper article, somebody did, talked about how Cleveland, the railroad president, had come up to visit the progress that was being made on the railroad. And they came to, this newspaper article was published in the 1900s, so they said where the Tryon School is, which is now the Tryon Town Hall, that's where they came to, but there was only one house in the whole Tryon. And Colvin, this big wealthy president, and the other guy that was walking with him decided to stop at the house and see if there's anything to eat. He said, no, I don't have anything to eat, but I've got some whiskey I can sell. And that was, Tryon was, where Tryon is today was just a desolate place. There was a few plantations, but very little structures. But anyway, he talked about having to walk or ride a hand cart up the part of the track and then walk for a while. And they had, of course, the prison camps and the prison cages, the wagons that had cages, and all these prisoners. He talks about that. And it's kind of an interesting story as the railroad was being built. And of course, it was expensive to build the railroad, and so they did use slave labor, not slave labor, but prison labor. The government in Raleigh decided to let the railroad use prisoners to build it. This is a picture of my great-grandpa, George Washington Metcalf. I did not know this picture existed until about 10 years ago. One of his granddaughters, my dad's first cousin, said, I've got a picture of him from when he was in his 20s. And she took it out to me, and I looked, and I said, there's a badge on his vest. And in the 1880 census of Polk County, he's listed as a prison guard over the railroad convicts that built the railroad. And I told this Irene Bell, that's her name, that had this picture. I said, did you ever notice this badge on here? She said, no, I never noticed that was a badge. And I told her why, because he was a prison guard. So this is really an interesting picture when you think about the railroad. And George Washington Metcalf, he was born in the 1850s and died in, 1840s, died in the 1948, and he lived to be 93 years old. My grandpa's father. He told one of his grandsons that he was there when the first train came through Saluda, and that was, I believe, 1876. And he said the railroad was so steep, it had never been done that steep before, and they weren't sure whether they could get the train stopped as it went down. I don't know how slow it went down the first time, but he told his grandchild that story. And that's a pretty interesting statement, when you talk about that first one. He also, Irene Bell also said, she never knew he was a prison guard, but she remembered him talking about black prisoners that had hair that was white as snow, the whitest hair that he'd ever seen. She remembered him talking about that, so that must have been the prisoners he was talking about. Now, I don't know if you know this. If you've got Matt Baumgartner's book, he does a chapter on the prisoners. But at one time in the Melrose area, about 13 of these convicts had escaped. I think they captured about 3, and the other ones ran away. You kind of wonder how long they hid out here in the mountains of Saluda, or if they found another place to go, or went out west, or whatever. But a lot of these slaves disappeared in that one prison break. And of course, in these mountains here, it's pretty easy. You can get away pretty easy, in these mountain coves and everything, as we well know. But that's, a little bit about the convicts that built that. And, I'm really proud of this picture of George Washington Metcalf here. George Washington Metcalf, I'm going to show some pictures of him in later life. As I said, he lived to be 93. This is a picture of him that was taken by a photographer named Doris Ullman. Doris Ullman was from New York City, and she spent the last few years of her life photographing Appalachian life. The two people she photographed here in this area was my great-grandpa and his wife, and this is in front of his house. He's got a pipe and tobacco. She took a bunch of pictures of him with different tools and things, but this was in 1934. And he Yeah, this is one of his last pictures as an old man in the 1940s. And this was a kind of a wheelchair. And Irene Bell told me that Grandpa called that his lounge chair. But it had wheels on it. But this was one of his last pictures as he died in 1893. But I wished that more people had interviewed him and written more stories about the early days of the railroad and the Civil War and all that kind of stuff, you know. And very little is known. But anyway, Coleman and Cox that built the railroad, and these are some of the people that did it. Now, another person that had a part in, now, how many of you folks are from up north? Okay, I want to give you a Yankee that helped somewhat. But Lemuel Wilcox was a Union soldier from Pennsylvania. Him and his father-in-law bought the old Columbus Mills estate. Columbus Mills was a big politician and a wealthy planter in, well, anyways, where the Mimosa Inn is in Lynn, that's where his place was. And Lemuel Wilcox and his father-in-law, McAvoy, had bought that and made it into an inn. Well, it was in this inn where they set up the first headquarters of the Spartanburg-Asheville Railroad. Now, it was called different names, but they met there and planned out the railroad in the home of these two people from up north in Pennsylvania. I just wanted to include you Yankees a little bit in there. You know? It wasn't all Confederates that helped build the railroad. That's the only thing I could come up with. But anyway, the Mimosa Inn burned down in the 19th. Let's see if I have an original picture of that. No, I don't. But that built out. But now the railroad had been built. The Civil War was over, and this is one of the early photos of the railroad. This has been colorized. It was an original color picture. But the Rhodes family believe, and all the research they do, that this was the Rhodes family homes, right across from the entrance of Pearson Falls. And this hill, it's all growed up in trees now. But they knew where that was, and one copy of this photograph says the old Rhodes place. Jesse Rhodes was the first coroner of Polk County, one of the first founding fathers of Polk County, and they believe that this was his house and this was his children's house. But that's just a really interesting picture. And when you look at the train, some of you people are train experts, and you can probably look at that and say what year, age that train was. But you can just look at it and see how old the train and cars are based on the look of it. I know that's an older version of the train, but that was probably one of the first pictures of the train coming through the area. And of course, after this railroad came, the town of Saluda was incorporated in 1881, and the town of Landrum was incorporated a few years later. However, there was no town there. The town of Earlsville was over where the I-26 Landrum exit is. And the reason that Landrum was built is because a guy named John Landrum had all that land where the town of Landrum is today. He came up with a bright idea that he will donate 2 acres to the railroad to build a depot there. And so when the depot's there, what's going to happen? All the real estate around there is going to be hotel owners and store owners and everything else. So he came up with that idea, and he became wealthy because of that. He was actually a chaplain in the Confederacy also. He was Reverend John Landrum. He pastored a lot of churches in early Landrum as well. So that's the story of Landrum. And Tryon people like to kind of think that they are it. And all the Henderson County, and all of my Polk County history, a lot of these people like think Tryon was made Polk County. But Tryon was the last town, in 1885, the last town that was incorporated in Polk County. They were the latecomers, but a lot of, especially northern people, came and invested in the town of Tryon, and it grew into the biggest, later on the biggest town. And Tryon, it was also Tryon, Saluda, and Landrum all had their shares of hotels that started springing up, and stores and businesses because of the railroad. And one of the things was, this was the first stop in the mountains for the people from Columbia and Charleston and Florida, which were escaping the heat. And this was the first stop in the mountains and foothills, and great climate and great temperatures. So this is where a lot of the summer people started building their summer houses. And again, this is a lot of what happened. The Civil War put a hold to it, and there's no telling what Columbus would be if it continued on and went through Columbus instead of this end of the county. A lot of people say Columbus would have been as big as Asheville. That's what I used to hear, as a kid when we were playing the railroad. Now, later on in the early 1900s, a couple of the people, the millionaires and the wealthy people in Polk County had formed a committee, once again, to start a railroad called the Polk County Railroad. And it was to come from this railroad in Landrum and go through Columbus and all the way through to Rutherford County. And it was going to help, grow Polk County even more. Now this time, they once again put it through a bond issue to raise tax money to pay for this Polk County Railroad in the 20th century. And it passed, except for the Saluda Township. They did not vote for it. They wanted rail traffic to come through here, but the other townships in Polk County all voted, and it passed. But for some reason, even though they voted to use the tax money to build this railroad, it was never built. The Polk County Railroad was never built. So I don't know if any of you know of that before, have heard of that before, but that was planned to go from this train track through Columbus to Rutherford County and bring in more commerce. But anyway, that's, some story about the Civil War and those that helped build the railroad and a little, maybe a few things that you never heard before.
Well, I'd like to thank you, James. Thank you very much for being here, and we appreciate it. Thank you so much.